It's no secret that tensions have been rising in Japan in the past few years due to the influx of tourists and the rise in foreign residents. It seems like every other week there's a new clip online of a foreigner acting obnoxiously in some way. Some of these clips are clearly disrespectful, like the videos of people doing pull-ups on a torii gate or blasting music from massive speakers on a train. But others can seem more harmless. One such example I saw recently was of a guy riding a hoverboard through Shinjuku, singing into a microphone, and the locals around him in the video? Well, some smiled and played along, others showed clear frustration, even telling him that it was too loud. It sparked some debate online, but was it really a problem? Now, of course, there's no universal reflection of how people feel about these things, but in general, regardless of intent, social harmony tends to come before personal expression. People may smile out of politeness and they may go along with it just to avoid tension. That doesn't mean that they're okay with it. Mistaking tolerance for approval is a fundamental misunderstanding of Japanese social behavior. It isn't about walking on eggshells, it's about reading the room and having a little bit of self-awareness. You might not mean harm, but intention doesn't always erase impact. In today's climate, these moments are no longer ignored. They go viral, they shape perception. Even if most tourists behave respectfully, perception is what sticks, and that perception is shifting. But let's take a step back for a moment and look at the bigger picture. In Japan, change tends to come about quietly. Not through protests or headlines necessarily, but through subtle policy tweaks and a change in social temperament. And we are now starting to see that shift take form. Just a few weeks ago, the Japanese government announced that, starting in 2027, tourists with unpaid medical bills may be denied re-entry, and foreign residents who haven't paid into the national health insurance system may have their visa renewals rejected. On paper, it sounds reasonable, even necessary, and most would likely agree with this. But beneath the policy is a shift in tone, and the timing of these changes signal the end of the quiet tolerance that has existed until now. For decades, foreigners in Japan were generally treated like guests. Rare, often admired, but generally seen as separate from the social fabric. But these subtle changes reflect something deeper, a growing sense that foreign presence in Japan is no longer a novelty and is increasingly viewed as part of the social fabric and not something that's outside of it. And as novelty becomes normality, fascination can give way to scrutiny. And ultimately, the benefit of the doubt has a time limit. Changes aren't just being seen in policy, but culturally too. Until relatively recently, Japan looked to the US and other Western countries as models for fashion, music, and lifestyle branding. Western celebrities were plastered across advertisements and often seen as a kind of cultural ideal. And while this hasn't disappeared entirely, it's no longer romanticized in the way that it once was. Over the past few decades, the focus has shifted. K-pop and Korean media now dominate the youth culture, and Japan has become more confident in its own identity. This isn't to say that Japan is turning inward out of resent or anything like that. It's more akin to a recalibration, and recalibration doesn't mean rejection. In fact, Japan's demographic crisis means that foreign presence isn't just tolerated, it's increasingly necessary. Japan's aging population and low birth rates mean that foreign workers are essential to fill gaps in the workforce. But this also means that Japan needs to plan carefully to ensure that its unique culture doesn't become gradually diluted. Much of Japanese social life is guided by unspoken rules, and small deviations can feel personal. The country is changing, but not entirely by choice. And that forced pace may be unsettling for some, whether it's the weak yen driving up prices and pushing locals out of popular spots, or the sheer volume of tourists overwhelming spaces not built to handle them. I want to dig a little bit deeper into this though, because while the reasons behind this shift are complex, what matters the most is how it's handled going forwards. Not just on the Japanese side, but for those coming here too, whether for a short visit or for something longer term. The relationship is changing, but the question is, into what? The number of foreigners in Japan now, not just tourists, but those looking to live, work, or study, is far higher than it's ever been. Social media has also played its part in amplifying the hype, turning Japan into a prime tourist destination for many. At the same time, Japan's population is aging fast, its workforce is shrinking, Without enough workers, essential services face mounting pressure, and while automation and AI may help in some areas, they can't replace the human labor still needed, especially in care, construction, and hospitality. All of this means that there's more foreigners in Japan than ever before, and the hard reality is that Japan must rely on more foreign workers to keep its economy and social systems afloat, at least for now. Without them, it's likely that labor shortages will deepen, public services will strain, and economic stagnation will accelerate. However, there's no manual that's been made for blending a society that's been built upon generations of trust, respect, and order with the messy realities that come with global movement, especially when newcomers may not have these same ingrained values. This is a country where children commute alone on public trains, and unmanned shops operate solely on trust that people will pay. That kind of social fabric isn't accidental. It's the product of generations of quiet cooperation, mutual respect, and trust. So as Japan stands between an urgent need for foreign labor and a deep-rooted attachment to cultural continuity, the challenge becomes preserving its identity whilst also adapting to what's increasingly inevitable. Now, given my position as a foreigner living here, I can't and don't want to speak for the Japanese. But what I do want to say is that as someone who has seen dramatic changes in my own country, even just over the last 10 to 20 years, I do emphasize with the rising anxiety and uncertainty that many people feel about the future. But in moments like this, it's also common and deeply unfortunate that foreigners often become scapegoats for long-standing internal problems. It's not about rejecting outsiders, it's about wanting to protect something valuable. And that's not a bad instinct, it's a human one. But what I can do, at least to those thinking of coming here, either as a tourist or for something long-term, is to share a few thoughts that might be worth thinking about, not as an expert or a point of authority, but as someone who has lived here for almost a decade now and has seen many of these changes come about from within. I know it's easy to draw parallels with Western countries, but it's important to recognize that immigration itself isn't inherently a problem, it's how it's managed. And that nuance matters because too often, the conversation gets reduced to emotional binaries where the reality is far more complex. Immigration can be a good thing, but only when it's skills-based, carefully managed, and supported by meaningful integration efforts. There's a lot of noise and chaos recently. You might not see it firsthand, but there's a growing sense of anxiety in Japan, often amplified by out-of-context clips, social media debates, and new political voices fueling these fears. I think it's important to cut through the noise and be practical about the situation though. I know some might assume that Japan's cohesion comes from ethnic or cultural homogeneity, and that plays a role of course. But beneath the surface, what I've really come to understand throughout my time here is that what holds things together truly is a kind of behavioral alignment, a shared understanding of how to act in public, how to coexist, and how to anticipate the needs of others. It doesn't mean that everyone thinks alike, just that there's a shared rhythm to daily life, an agreement on how to move through the world together. In the end, when living amongst others, what really matters isn't whether someone looks like you, it's whether they move through the world with the same shared values that support a harmonious coexistence. And if we collectively care about what makes this country so special, then it's worth asking, what does it mean for us to visit or live here in a way that honors what already exists? So I want to make it very clear, I'm not here to tell Japan what it should or shouldn't do. That's definitely not my place. I would, however, like to offer open dialogue to those who come in as guests, whether tourists, short-term workers, or long-term residents, about the responsibility that we carry, not to blend in perfectly, but to show that we're willing to try to maintain the standards that already exist, the same standards that created the society so many of us were drawn to in the first place, and to hold ourselves accountable to those standards, even when no one is watching. That's not about guilt, it's about gratitude, about showing respect for the space that we occupy, even if only temporarily. And honestly, I think that should be a universal truth, no matter where we go. I've always found it interesting how in Japanese, the phrase ruro momoru means to follow the rules, but the verb mamoru literally means to protect. That difference feels really important, and I think that there's something telling in it. Following implies a kind of passive compliance, whereas protecting something implies a sort of active stewardship. It implies both ownership and personal responsibility. In this way, protecting the rules is a form of social care. It shows the value we place on the society we're part of. Instead of obedience or fear of punishment, it's about saying, I care enough about this place to uphold what holds it together. So with that in mind, what does this mean on a practical level? I came across a post online recently from somebody who was about to travel to Japan, and they were essentially asking whether some of the smaller rules, like eating whilst walking or speaking on trains, are exaggerated. And surprisingly, most of the responses from other tourists who had already visited Japan were essentially saying that it was overblown and that nobody seemed to care, at least not enough to say anything, and some even highlighted that they had seen Japanese people do these things themselves. But that kind of logic misses the point. In Japan, silence doesn't mean approval. In fact, most people are probably just too polite to confront you directly. So if nobody says anything, it's not a green light. It's a chance to show that you understand the culture well enough to act even without being told. Japanese isn't a direct language, and that reflects the broader culture. Most communication happens in what's not said. Tone, timing, subtle cues. For those who come from cultures where direct confrontation is the norm, this can be hard to recognize or interpret, but that makes it even more important to pay attention. From the moment you arrive, your actions matter. You are responsible for adapting to the local norms, even if they feel unfamiliar or unnecessary to you. Making an effort, especially with the small things, goes a long way though. Again, this isn't about walking on eggshells or being afraid of making a mistake, but if you've looked something up in advance and you've understood what's expected and you still choose not to do it, well, that's just on you. The way I see it is that if you're able to plan a trip and book a flight to get here, then you're more than capable of being able to research in advance what's expected. In today's world where information is instantaneously accessible, ignorance isn't really a free pass anymore. This goes for residents too, maybe even more so. Knowing how to sort trash, register for the right systems, ask questions, and learn the language, it all takes time, but that's part of the deal. It's part of the commitment that you make when you choose to live here. It's not about being perfect. It's about making an effort. I think there's a broader mindset that also needs rethinking. The whole idea of gaijin dakara shoganai. The notion that just because somebody is a foreigner, they shouldn't be expected to understand or follow all of the cultural rules and norms. But that kind of mentality can no longer support the kind of global movement that Japan is seeing today, and it only fuels the anxiety on both sides. Maybe that made sense in the early 2000s when global travel and communication were not what they are today. But today, that kind of mindset only serves to deepen the anxiety. If we treat foreign participation as inevitable but never accountable, we'll just end up feeding the anxiety that we're trying to ease. It's those small, unspoken rules, practiced by almost everyone, that make Japan what it is today. They're embedded in Japanese society and they're part of what visitors admire, but when a few people feel or are treated as exempt, those rules begin to slip, and the image that once felt so special quietly begins to dilute, and over time, that dilution becomes hard to undo. Back in London, you have to stay acutely aware of your belongings and surroundings, not out of paranoia, but out of the reality that someone might legitimately just take them from you, even if you let your guard down for just a second. That kind of vigilance has become so normal in many modern cities around the world, but should it be? Should that kind of alertness be a baseline for life inside of a modern society? These kinds of occurrences are extremely rare in Japan, not by accident, but because the quiet, often smaller and overlooked parts of the social fabric are treated with just as much care as the obvious ones. They're the foundation of how trust is built and maintained, and that trust is what holds everything together. It's about placing value in what society actually is, not a system of oppression and rules, but as a shared collective agreement on how to live together. That only works when everyone actively contributes to it, and when that happens, it creates a better living environment for everyone. The truth is, more people are coming to Japan than ever before, to visit, to work, to live, But what we don't talk about enough is that living side by side doesn't automatically mean living together. If we share the same spaces, ride the same trains, walk the same streets, there has to be a shared understanding of how we hold these spaces together. This should apply anywhere, but in Japan's case, it doesn't mean becoming Japanese. It means understanding what Japan values. And if you choose to be here, it then becomes your responsibility to reflect those values in your actions, whether you agree with them or not. The problems begin when people move somewhere and expect the rules to bend for them, or assume that their own cultural preferences should take priority. That kind of entitlement doesn't always show up loudly. Sometimes it's quiet, but it does grow. And no one likes to feel like they're slowly losing something, especially not the social fabric that gives a place its character. When that feeling spreads, trust begins to erode, and once it's gone, it's hard to rebuild. That's why this matters. Respect isn't just about gestures, it's about behavior, about showing that you understand where you are and proving that you care enough to act accordingly. Japan is at a point in history that it's never been before. Being here means being part of something, whether you notice it or not, and how you carry yourself becomes part of what carries the space around you. So remember to act in a way that respects the place that you're in.